A containment siren was already screaming across 3 layers of reality when something struck the quarantine field hard enough to bend it inward like glass under pressure, and every monitoring satellite above New York registered the same impossible reading at once. A kinetic impact with no measurable energy signature and no dimensional origin point. SHIELD's orbital lattice began collapsing in overlapping hexagonal failures, while Silent Möbius psychic operators inside the Tokyo interlock suddenly lost sensory contact with the extradimensional incursion they had been isolating for the last 17 minutes, as though something had stepped directly into the sealed anomaly and replaced it without displacing any matter at all. Avengers Tower responded by deploying automated countermeasures that were designed to stall cosmic invasions for at least 40 seconds. Yet whatever had just arrived walked through the suspended gravity netting and psionic suppression layers without triggering resistance protocols, forcing Tony Stark to assume that the system itself had misidentified a threat already inside the perimeter. And then the external threat they were trying to contain started reacting to him instead. If you're still watching, you need to understand that subscribing here isn't support, it's preparation. Because once this escalation reaches the point SHIELD classified as irreversible, the next parts won't be about stopping the collapse, but surviving whatever replaces reality when containment finally fails. By the time the containment lattice above Manhattan dropped below 70% structural integrity, SHIELD's deep space telemetry had already stopped agreeing with itself, which was a situation director Nick Fury had only ever seen once before during a classified Kree intrusion that nearly collapsed the Atlantic Rift. This time, however, the breach wasn't expanding outward from the anomaly Silent Möbius had identified earlier that morning, but inward toward a single undefined coordinate drifting slowly across the suspended quarantine field, as though gravity itself had chosen to follow it. Maria Hill watched 3 separate sensor arrays attempt to isolate a mass signature from the disturbance and fail in ways that implied absence rather than camouflage, while every psychic dampening relay Silent Möbius had installed across the isolation perimeter began reporting a sudden inability to maintain telepathic cohesion within the sealed zone. Inside the Möbius Tokyo Interlock Command Theater, Katsumi Liqueur had already ordered a synchronized psychic scan of the containment pocket the moment the Avengers' orbital grid reported an unknown intrusion vector. But what returned through the shared neural channel wasn't interference or resistance. It was nothing at all. Not emptiness in the traditional sense, but an absolute lack of detectable consciousness patterns where something undeniably physical was moving through space. Rally Cheyenne initiated a secondary empathic sweep, calibrated to detect even fragmented cognitive signatures, and the feedback spike that followed forced her to disengage before the psychic loop destabilized her sensory cortex, which meant whatever had just entered the containment zone could not be categorized as human, alien, or extradimensional by any known Möbius classification model. Meanwhile, at street level beneath the shimmering distortion dome that now sealed 12 city blocks into a suspended dimensional quarantine, Saitama had been trying to figure out why his grocery bag had vanished mid-step after he walked through what he initially assumed was construction scaffolding. He turned around once, noticed the skyline looked slightly warped compared to earlier that afternoon, and then shrugged before continuing down what used to be Lexington Avenue until an invisible gravity net descended from above and flattened 3 abandoned taxis around him into compressed metal shells. The net didn't slow him down, mostly because he didn't notice it until his shoe snagged briefly on an electromagnetic anchor node embedded in the pavement, which snapped loose the moment he shifted his weight and sent a containment warning back to Avengers Tower. Tony Stark interpreted the anomaly as an internal failure at first, because nothing inside the quarantine zone should have been capable of applying directional stress against a stabilized gravitic restraint system without triggering kinetic resistance protocols. Yet the system logs showed the net disengaging around a moving coordinate that didn't correspond to any known hostile entity currently inside the breach. He patched the feed directly to Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff, while JARVIS attempted to correlate motion tracking with Möbius psychic overlays. But the telepathic layer remained blank, which led Bruce Banner to suggest they might be dealing with a non-sentient dimensional organism. That theory lasted until Thor's atmospheric pressure sensors detected a localized displacement pattern, consistent with bipedal locomotion, moving steadily toward the heart of the anomaly Möbius had spent the last hour attempting to contain. Back inside the interlock, Yuki Seiko initiated a psionic suppression field calibrated to immobilize reality phase intruders by severing motor command pathways through cognitive interference, which had previously stopped Class S spectral incursions in under 5 seconds, but the field failed to anchor to anything within the moving coordinate. Instead, the suppression wave passed through Saitama, as though he weren't occupying the same cognitive bandwidth as the rest of the quarantine population, which resulted in a cascading sensor echo that Möbius initially interpreted as the entity existing across multiple mental states simultaneously. Saitama paused when the air around him started shimmering again, mostly because it reminded him of a heat wave, and briefly wondered if he had walked into some kind of festival projection system before a telekinetic restraint field slammed down hard enough to fracture the street beneath his feet. The concrete cratered outward under the pressure, nearby storefront windows shattered instantly, and a Möbius containment drone hovering above the intersection confirmed full immobilization of the target. Then Saitama took one step forward, and the restraint collapsed without resistance. Up in the Avengers observation deck, Steve Rogers leaned forward as motion tracking finally resolved into a visual feed, showing a man in a yellow suit walking calmly through overlapping containment layers that had been designed to hold celestial-tier entities for short durations. Natasha immediately requested authorization for diplomatic contact before S.H.I.E.L.D. escalated to kinetic quarantine protocols, because nothing about the subject's behavior indicated aggression. Yet the fact that the anomaly Silent Möbius had been isolating was now converging toward his position implied a causal relationship neither team understood. At the center of the sealed zone, the extradimensional incursion Möbius had designated as Rift Entity 9 began altering its trajectory for the first time since arrival. Saitama noticed the sky looked darker ahead and figured he should probably head in the opposite direction. But before he could turn back, a spiraling mass of fractured geometry descended from above the containment dome and struck the pavement less than 30 meters away, causing S.H.I.E.L.D.'s isolation field to flare violently in response. Avengers Tower registered the impact as a dimensional lifeform attempting forced synchronization with an internal anomaly, and every Möbius psychic operator felt the same thing simultaneously as the Rift entity's awareness pivoted toward the one presence inside the quarantine it could not classify. Because for the first time since breaching the barrier between universes, it had found something it didn't understand. And it was already moving. Avengers Tower's threat assessment grid updated faster than Tony Stark could manually override it, because the moment Rift Entity 9 altered its trajectory toward the unidentified figure inside the quarantine zone, every predictive model S.H.I.E.L.D. had built for extradimensional containment began returning mutually exclusive outcomes. Maria Hill watched as the isolation dome's integrity dropped another 6% without any external force being applied, which suggested the incursion wasn't attacking the barrier anymore but reacting to something within it, while Silent Möbius telemetry from Tokyo confirmed that the entity's psychic pressure had shifted from wide-spectrum destabilization to targeted convergence. In practical terms, that meant the thing they had been trying to keep inside the sealed zone for the last 23 minutes had just decided something else in there mattered more than escaping. Steve Rogers was the first to say out loud what the system logs were implying, which was that their unknown internal presence had either triggered the Rift entity's adaptive response or become its new objective, and neither option suggested coincidence. Natasha Romanoff requested a direct audio channel into the quarantine before S.H.I.E.L.D. initiated dimensional isolation protocols that would permanently sever the zone from baseline reality. Because if the unidentified individual was capable of influencing the incursion's behavior, diplomacy might still prevent escalation. Fury approved the attempt under the assumption that any entity able to move freely inside Möbius-grade suppression fields would at least recognize the concept of negotiation, even if its origin remained untraceable. Down below, Saitama had just finished looking at what used to be a bus stop now twisted into a floating spiral by overlapping gravitational distortions when the air in front of him flickered and projected a S.H.I.E.L.D. contact interface calibrated for cross-species communication. The voice that followed identified itself as Captain Steve Rogers and asked him to remain stationary for his own safety, while containment teams attempted to stabilize the anomaly approaching his position, which Saitama interpreted as someone politely asking him to wait while they dealt with whatever had just smashed into the street nearby. He glanced once at the fractured geometry pulsing faintly in the intersection, then back at the hovering projection, and responded by asking if this was some kind of hero test site, because he had lost his groceries earlier and would like to go home. Inside Avengers Tower, Bruce Banner muttered that extradimensional infiltrators rarely opened with logistical complaints, yet the Rift entity's continued advance toward the subject's position made disengagement impossible. Thor stepped toward the observation feed as Möbius psychic operators attempted a second telepathic scan, only to encounter the same absence of detectable cognition that had disrupted their earlier efforts, which now extended to S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own neural resonance detectors. Katsumi Liqueur confirmed from Tokyo that the unidentified presence exhibited no measurable psychic architecture whatsoever, not even the fragmented baseline associated with non-sapient extradimensional fauna, forcing Möbius Command to consider the possibility that they were dealing with a kinetic phenomenon masquerading as a biological organism. That theory collapsed the moment Saitama leaned down to pick up a piece of the street that had cracked under the earlier telekinetic restraint and casually tossed it aside, because the containment drone tracking his movement registered intentional motor coordination without any accompanying mental signature. Fury ordered Phase 2 misidentification protocol into effect, which allowed S.H.I.E.L.D. to classify the unknown internal presence as a rogue reality intruder until proven otherwise, thereby authorizing limited engagement by the Avengers under diplomatic guidelines. Steve descended first, entering the quarantine through a stabilized aperture while Natasha and Thor maintained overwatch from above, and the moment his boots touched down inside the sealed zone, Möbius confirmed that the Rift entity's trajectory had shifted again to intersect both his position and the unidentified figure simultaneously. Saitama noticed the new arrival mostly because the ground stopped shaking for a second, which he took as a good sign until the fractured mass ahead of him began folding inward along angles that shouldn't exist in physical space. Steve approached carefully, identifying himself again and requesting clarification regarding the subject's point of origin, but the answer he received was that Saitama had been heading to a supermarket before everything got weird and asked if the floating rubble was part of the city's normal infrastructure. Behind them, Rift Entity 9 completed its convergence vector. The first strike didn't come from the entity itself, but from the quarantine dome reacting to its proximity, as Möbius suppression fields intensified automatically in an attempt to immobilize both internal presences before synchronization occurred. The psionic wave that followed flattened 3 adjacent buildings and locked every Avengers combat system into defensive posture. Yet Saitama remained upright at the center of the pressure gradient, looking mildly confused as the pavement around him compressed into a shallow crater. Steve turned just in time to see the entity descend. And this time, it wasn't interested in the barrier at all. The moment Rift Entity 9 redirected its descent away from the quarantine barrier and toward the two human figures standing beneath it, Avengers Tower's internal threat modeling stopped prioritizing containment and began calculating survivability windows for assets already inside the sealed zone. Tony Stark watched as S.H.I.E.L.D.'s dimensional isolation protocols queued automatically behind Möbius suppression escalation, which meant the system had reached the threshold where preserving baseline reality took precedence over retrieving anyone trapped within the dome. Maria Hill didn't need to ask what that implied, because Fury had already authorized Stark Industries' Emergency Corporate Containment Directive, a last-resort failsafe allowing privately owned orbital infrastructure to reinforce or replace S.H.I.E.L.D.'s collapsing quarantine lattice if government hardware failed to maintain structural integrity. Across the Pacific, the Möbius-Tokyo interlock registered a surge in psychic turbulence as Rift Entity 9 began altering its geometry in response to proximity, but the disturbance wasn't centered on Captain Rogers as expected. Instead, every empathic sensor in the network reported the incursion orienting itself toward the unidentified presence standing less than 5 meters away, despite their continued inability to detect any conventional consciousness pattern associated with his movement. Rally Cheyenne attempted a third scan using a non-invasive perception drift calibrated for extradimensional camouflage, and the feedback loop that followed forced Möbius Command to suspend all direct telepathic contact inside the zone, because whatever cognitive architecture the subject possessed could not be engaged without destabilizing the operator attempting the connection. Down below, Steve Rogers braced instinctively as the air pressure shifted around them, yet Saitama reacted with the same mild curiosity he might have shown to unexpected weather, tilting his head slightly as Rift Entity 9 folded inward along axes that violated spatial continuity. The entity's surface refracted light into recursive fragments that Möbius analysts later compared to a Möbius strip collapsing into itself, each layer attempting to synchronize with something occupying the same dimensional address without successfully displacing it. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s audio channel remained open, allowing Natasha Romanoff to request immediate retreat before Phase 3 isolation engaged. But Steve hesitated when the entity's advance slowed within striking distance of the unknown man, rather than accelerating into contact. Avengers Tower interpreted that hesitation as predatory assessment. Tony initiated the directive before Fury could countermand it, deploying Stark orbital drones equipped with adaptive gravitic anchors designed to reinforce dimensional shear points along the quarantine perimeter. The drones arrived in under 12 seconds and began projecting a secondary containment lattice across the upper atmosphere, which Möbius confirmed was necessary, as Rift Entity 9's proximity to the unidentified presence caused localized reality drift severe enough to desynchronize S.H.I.E.L.D.'s primary field generators. Katsumi Liqueur reported from Tokyo that the incursion was no longer attempting to breach the barrier outward, but to collapse the internal dimensional gradient around a single coordinate that still refused classification. Saitama glanced at Steve once, then back at the spiraling mass ahead, and asked whether this counted as an enemy or just a malfunctioning building, because it looked like it might fall over soon. Steve didn't get the chance to answer before the entity moved. Its first direct contact with baseline matter came in the form of a spatial compression wave that sheared the intersection apart without producing heat or sound, forcing Stark's drones to divert power from the upper lattice to prevent catastrophic collapse along the quarantine seam. Möbius suppression fields intensified automatically, yet the same absence that had confounded their earlier scans now propagated outward from the unidentified presence, creating a blind zone where psychic pressure simply ceased to function. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s kinetic monitors registered Captain Rogers being driven backward by the wave, while the subject at its center remained standing, his cape fluttering slightly in air that no longer followed atmospheric rules. Fury ordered full dimensional quarantine. High above the city, Stark's corporate directive completed synchronization with S.H.I.E.L.D.'s isolation grid, locking the 12-block containment zone into a semi-permanent pocket reality designed to prevent further spread even if the internal environment destabilized completely. Möbius Command protested the escalation, because severing the zone would trap Rift Entity 9 inside with an unclassified anomaly capable of disrupting psychic suppression architecture. But the alternative involved allowing the incursion to synchronize with baseline reality unchecked. Inside the dome, the ground began folding upward toward the entity's core. And this time, it was already reaching for him. When S.H.I.E.L.D.'s dimensional quarantine protocols finalized, the 12-block containment zone didn't simply seal off from the rest of Manhattan. It slipped half a degree out of phase with baseline reality, which was enough to cause every structural support inside the dome to begin interpreting gravity along slightly different vectors. Maria Hill watched entire sections of Lexington Avenue buckle upward toward the center of the sealed pocket as Stark's orbital drones struggled to maintain lattice cohesion, because Rift Entity 9 had stopped behaving like an external invader and was now attempting to restructure the internal environment around the one coordinate Möbius still couldn't classify. Silent Möbius Command reported simultaneous psychic feedback from operators across Tokyo as the suppression field encountered expanding regions of null response inside the quarantine, forcing Katsumi Liqueur to conclude that whatever effect the unidentified presence was generating had begun propagating through the entity itself. Avengers Tower lost 3 surveillance feeds at once as spatial shear folded a row of apartment buildings into overlapping reflections of themselves. Yet the visual channel tracking Captain Rogers remained intact long enough to show him regaining his footing inside a landscape that no longer obeyed linear distance. Natasha Romanoff requested immediate extraction authorization, but Fury denied it when Stark confirmed that opening an aperture through the stabilized pocket would risk allowing Rift Entity 9 to synchronize with the external dimensional gradient. Thor volunteered to enter regardless, citing the need to prevent the incursion from completing whatever convergence process Möbius believed was underway. And within seconds, he descended through the reinforced lattice, Mjolnir drawing atmospheric charge that refused to behave normally once he crossed the quarantine threshold. Down below, Saitama had started walking again, mostly because the ground tilting upward toward the spiraling mass ahead made it difficult to remain in one place without sliding. Steve called out for him to stop moving, explaining that the environment was destabilizing due to the entity's proximity. Yet the response he received was a distracted acknowledgement followed by a question about whether the floating debris counted as littering if it wasn't technically on the ground anymore. Möbius psychic operators attempted a remote motor inhibition sweep calibrated for indirect interference, but the command pathways they targeted simply didn't exist in any recognizable configuration, resulting in a suppression wave that immobilized 2 abandoned police cruisers while leaving the intended subject unaffected. Rift Entity 9 reacted immediately. The fractured geometry composing its outer layer began collapsing inward at an accelerated rate as Thor touched down beside Rogers, because the presence of a second Avenger inside the null zone appeared to provide additional reference points for synchronization. Möbius telemetry showed the incursion attempting to map both individuals against the same internal gradient that continued to fail whenever it intersected Saitama's position, producing a cascading misalignment that spread outward through the pocket reality like a stress fracture in glass. Stark's corporate directive diverted more power into the orbital lattice as dimensional drift extended beyond the original 12-block perimeter, causing traffic lights outside the quarantine to flicker in patterns that S.H.I.E.L.D.'s analysts later identified as phase interference rather than electrical malfunction. Saitama paused when a section of pavement folded up in front of him, then stepped over it as though navigating a puddle, which coincided with Möbius reporting a sudden drop in psychic turbulence along the entity's forward edge. Rally Cheyenne interpreted the data as the incursion encountering resistance for the first time since arrival, but the absence of any detectable force suggested the interference wasn't opposing synchronization so much as preventing it from resolving. Steve realized at the same moment that Rift Entity 9 wasn't attacking the unidentified presence directly, but attempting to incorporate him into its internal structure, and failing in ways that were beginning to destabilize the surrounding environment. Thor moved to engage. Mjolnir struck the entity's outer shell with enough force to register on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s deep space monitors, yet the impact failed to produce lasting displacement, because the geometry simply reconfigured around the contact point. In response, the incursion extended a lattice of spatial compression toward both Avengers, forcing Stark's drones to reinforce the quarantine seam as dimensional pressure spiked across the city grid. Möbius suppression fields intensified again, but the null zone expanded in tandem, centered precisely on the man in the yellow suit who had now stopped moving because the air in front of him looked thicker than usual. Outside the dome, New York's skyline began reflecting itself at impossible angles. Inside, the entity completed another convergence cycle. And this time, the fracture spread beyond containment. By the time the first mirrored skyline appeared above the East River without any corresponding atmospheric disturbance, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s global monitoring network had already escalated the quarantine event from localized containment failure to a potential planetary synchronization cascade. Maria Hill received confirmation from 3 separate orbital platforms that dimensional shear originating inside the Manhattan pocket was no longer respecting the stabilized perimeter Stark Industries had projected, because Rift Entity 9's repeated attempts to incorporate the unidentified presence into its internal structure were producing misalignment waves that propagated outward through baseline reality itself. Silent Möbius Command relayed simultaneous psychic disturbances from operators stationed in Osaka, Berlin, and Vancouver, each reporting momentary lapses in spatial continuity that suggested the incursion's influence had begun bleeding across universes rather than remaining confined to the sealed zone. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark watched the corporate containment directive exceed its original operational parameters as Stark orbital drones diverted power from non-essential satellites to maintain lattice cohesion. Yet even reinforced gravitic anchors struggled to compensate for a pocket reality, attempting to restructure itself around a coordinate that refused synchronization. Fury authorized the global engagement threshold, which allowed S.H.I.E.L.D. to deploy military assets designed for extraterrestrial incursion scenarios, despite the risk of further destabilizing the quarantine seam, because Möbius telemetry indicated Rift Entity 9 had entered an adaptive phase triggered by sustained failure to integrate the unknown internal anomaly. Down below, Thor and Steve Rogers found themselves standing on a street that no longer extended in a straight line, as Lexington Avenue now curved upward toward the spiraling mass, occupying the center of the containment zone. Mjolnir's atmospheric charge dissipated unpredictably in air that interpreted distance as suggestion rather than rule, forcing Thor to rely on physical strikes that registered against the entity's outer geometry without producing measurable displacement. Steve attempted to draw Saitama back from the advancing convergence point, explaining that the environment was collapsing under stress from the incursion's adaptive response. Yet the reply he received was a polite acknowledgement followed by a request for directions to the nearest exit. Möbius psychic operators attempted a coordinated perception drift to determine whether the unidentified presence was generating the null zone intentionally. But the scan returned the same absence that had destabilized earlier telepathic contact attempts, now extending across a radius large enough to interfere with Rift Entity 9's internal mapping processes. Katsumi Liqueur reported that the incursion appeared to interpret the anomaly as a causal obstruction rather than a hostile force, prompting it to increase synchronization pressure in an attempt to resolve the discrepancy through environmental restructuring. That pressure reached critical levels when the ground beneath Saitama's feet began folding inward along non-Euclidean seams. He leaned slightly to maintain balance as the pavement tilted toward the entity's core, unaware that S.H.I.E.L.D.'s deep space monitors had just registered identical distortions forming above the Pacific Rim. Stark's drones redirected additional power into the lattice, as Möbius confirmed that the incursion's adaptive phase had escalated into global resonance, meaning every failed convergence attempt inside the quarantine was now producing dimensional stress along corresponding coordinates worldwide. Fury ordered immediate deployment of aerospace defense platforms to reinforce the upper atmosphere, because if Rift Entity 9 completed synchronization with baseline reality through indirect propagation, containment would become irrelevant. Inside the dome, the entity extended another lattice of spatial compression toward the null zone. Steve braced against the pressure wave as it sheared through what remained of the intersection, while Thor moved to intercept using momentum, rather than lightning in an environment that refused stable energy transfer. Saitama watched the approaching distortion with mild interest, until a floating section of sidewalk drifted into his path, which he nudged aside without considering that Möbius telemetry showed the incursion's forward edge destabilizing again upon contact with his expanding radius of influence. High above, Stark's corporate directive initiated atmospheric lockdown. Across the globe, cities began reporting mirrored structures where none should exist. And inside the quarantine, Rift Entity 9 accelerated its convergence. When S.H.I.E.L.D. initiated the planetary lockdown initiative, it wasn't because Rift Entity 9 had breached the Manhattan containment pocket, but because the pocket itself had started imprinting its internal misalignment onto the rest of the world. Maria Hill received synchronized reports from Aerospace Command, indicating that dimensional variants matching the quarantine's distortion signature had appeared above Mumbai, Sao Paulo, and Reykjavik within the same 90-second interval, which Möbius analysts immediately correlated to the incursion's repeated synchronization failures inside the null zone surrounding the unidentified presence. Stark's orbital drones attempted to compensate by extending the corporate containment lattice into a global reinforcement grid. Yet every additional anchor point introduced new stress fractures as baseline reality struggled to reconcile conflicting spatial constants. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark watched the initiative reroute power from civilian satellites to S.H.I.E.L.D.'s atmospheric stabilizers, while Fury authorized deployment of experimental phase-lock beacons, designed to prevent large-scale environmental restructuring. Silent Möbius Command warned that such measures might inadvertently amplify the incursion's adaptive response, because Rift Entity 9 had begun treating failed convergence as an environmental error to be corrected rather than an obstacle to be avoided, which meant increasing structural resistance could accelerate its attempts to integrate the anomaly disrupting its internal mapping. Down below, Thor felt the change before any instrument registered it, as gravity inside the quarantine shifted laterally in response to another convergence cycle, forcing both Avengers to anchor themselves against a building facade that now interpreted vertical support as optional. Steve called out to Saitama again, urging him to move away from the entity's forward edge before the next synchronization attempt completed, Yet the man in the yellow suit had stopped walking entirely, not out of caution, but because the air in front of him appeared to ripple in a way that suggested something large was about to happen. Möbius psychic operators confirmed that Rift Entity 9 was no longer attempting to incorporate the unidentified presence through direct structural overlap, but by rewriting the surrounding dimensional gradient until synchronization became inevitable. Katsumi Liqueur reported that the null zone centered on Saitama had expanded in tandem with each failed attempt, producing a cognitive blind spot large enough to interfere with the incursion's adaptive algorithms, which now compensated by increasing compression across a wider radius. That compression arrived as a cascading spatial wave that flattened what remained of the intersection into a single reflective plane. Steve's shield absorbed part of the impact, while Thor drove Mjolnir into the ground to maintain position. Yet Möbius telemetry showed the entity's forward lattice destabilizing again upon intersecting the null zone's boundary. Shield's deep space monitors registered a simultaneous drop in dimensional coherence above the southern hemisphere, forcing Fury to escalate the initiative into full atmospheric lockdown despite Stark's warning that the corporate directive was nearing structural overload. Saitama leaned forward slightly as the reflective plane extended toward him, then stepped onto it as though testing a frozen pond, unaware that Möbius had just recorded another synchronization failure propagating through Rift Entity 9's internal geometry. High above the city, the global lattice flickered. Across the oceans, mirrored horizons began to form. And inside the quarantine, the entity prepared its largest convergence yet. By the time the planetary lockdown initiative reached full operational capacity, SHIELD's analysts had already begun referring to the Manhattan quarantine not as an incursion site but as a dimensional fault line, because Rift Entity 9's adaptive convergence cycles were no longer confined to the pocket reality. Stark's corporate directive had stabilized. Maria Hill watched global telemetry feeds update in real time as gravitational constants fluctuated across multiple hemispheres, each disturbance matching the same spatial compression signature Möbius had recorded every time the incursion attempted to synchronize with the unidentified presence inside the dome. Silent Möbius Command confirmed that psychic operators stationed across 3 continents were now experiencing intermittent perceptual desynchronization, which Katsumi Liqueur described as reality briefly forgetting how to maintain a single coherent state. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark rerouted the last available power reserves into the orbital lattice as phase-lock beacons struggled to maintain atmospheric stability. Yet every reinforcement measure appeared to trigger another adaptive response from the entity below. Fury authorized deployment of SHIELD's deep strike aerospace platforms, despite the risk of kinetic feedback, destabilizing the quarantine seam further, because Möbius telemetry indicated Rift Entity 9 had entered a structural override phase in which environmental resistance was treated as incomplete synchronization rather than opposition. Down within the sealed zone, Thor and Steve Rogers braced as the reflective plane beneath their feet began tilting toward the entity's core, forcing nearby structures to collapse inward along axes that no longer aligned with Earth's gravitational field. Steve attempted to reach Saitama again, explaining that the next convergence cycle might restructure the entire pocket reality around its internal gradient. Yet the man in the yellow suit appeared more concerned with maintaining balance on a surface that now behaved like liquid glass. Möbius psychic suppression fields intensified automatically as Rift Entity 9 expanded its forward lattice across the null zone, but the absence of detectable cognition surrounding Saitama continued to interfere with the incursion's mapping processes. Rally Cheyenne reported that the entity's internal geometry was beginning to fragment along synchronization seams, which should have indicated structural failure if not for the simultaneous increase in environmental compression, propagating outward through the quarantine. That compression reached critical levels when the skyline itself began folding toward the convergence point. Thor moved to intercept the advancing lattice with a direct strike, yet the impact failed to produce displacement as the entity reconfigured around Mjolnir's trajectory, forcing S.H.I.E.L.D.'s orbital platforms to absorb the resulting dimensional feedback. Möbius telemetry registered another synchronization failure upon contact with the null zone, but this time, the misalignment propagated through the entity's entire structure, causing its outer layers to collapse inward before reforming in a more aggressive configuration. Saitama glanced upward as the air above him fractured into overlapping reflections, then back at the advancing distortion, unaware that global resistance efforts had begun to fail in response to the incursion's latest adaptation. High above, Stark's lattice lost cohesion across two atmospheric sectors. Across the world, phase-lock beacons flickered into standby. And inside the quarantine, Rift Entity 9 initiated structural override. The dominance threshold was never intended to be reached during a live containment scenario, because its activation criteria assumed a hostile intelligence attempting planetary synchronization, rather than an adaptive incursion reacting to something it could neither detect nor displace. Maria Hill watched the authorization cascade finalize across S.H.I.E.L.D.'s global command network, as Rift Entity 9's structural override phase forced Stark's corporate containment lattice into a feedback loop, diverting atmospheric stabilizers away from civilian infrastructure to maintain dimensional coherence along the Manhattan Fault line. Silent Möbius Command confirmed that psychic turbulence had reached levels previously associated with universe-bridging convergence events. Yet every telepathic scan of the null zone at the incursion center continued to return the same absolute absence of consciousness surrounding the unidentified presence. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark attempted to recalibrate the orbital drones for asymmetric reinforcement, hopping to stabilize the quarantine seam by redistributing gravitic anchor points across adjacent sectors of reality. But Möbius telemetry indicated that Rift Entity 9 had already begun compensating for environmental resistance by increasing synchronization pressure along indirect vectors. Fury authorized S.H.I.E.L.D.'s deep strike platforms to engage from exo-atmospheric range, despite the risk of kinetic interference, because the initiative's remaining phase-lock beacons had started dropping offline in response to spatial constants drifting outside operational tolerance. Down within the sealed pocket, Steve Rogers struggled to maintain footing on a surface that no longer acknowledged static orientation, as Lexington Avenue curved upward into a suspended arc leading directly toward the spiraling mass occupying the convergence point. Thor moved alongside him, Mjolnir's atmospheric charge dissipating unpredictably in an environment that refused stable energy transfer. Yet the entity's forward lattice continued advancing despite repeated disruption from physical contact. Saitama remained where he was, not out of tactical positioning, but because the reflective plane beneath his feet had become easier to stand on than the folded debris surrounding it. He watched the advancing distortion with mild curiosity as Möbius suppression fields intensified automatically, attempting to immobilize all internal presences before the next convergence cycle completed. Yet the psionic wave that followed failed to anchor to his position in any measurable way. Rally Cheyenne reported that the null zone had expanded again. Katsumi Liqueur confirmed that Rift Entity 9's internal geometry was beginning to fragment along synchronization seams previously considered stable. Yet instead of collapsing, the incursion had begun redistributing structural integrity toward its forward edge. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s deep space monitors registered identical distortion forming along the upper atmosphere above the quarantine, forcing Stark to divert additional power into the lattice, as baseline reality struggled to reconcile conflicting dimensional gradients. The dominance threshold engaged when the entity's outer layers extended beyond the sealed pocket's internal boundaries, without breaching the quarantine seam, indicating an attempt to overwrite environmental constants rather than escape confinement. Fury ordered immediate deployment of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s atmospheric containment grid, which initiated a global resonance dampening sequence designed to prevent further propagation of synchronization pressure. Inside the dome, the ground beneath Steve and Thor folded inward along a seam that Möbius later described as a failed convergence path, forcing both Avengers to retreat toward the null zone, where the incursion's mapping processes continued to destabilize. Saitama leaned slightly as the reflective plane tilted toward the entity's core, then stepped forward when a floating section of roadway drifted into his path, unaware that Möbius telemetry had just recorded another synchronization failure upon intersecting his expanding radius of influence. Rift Entity 9 reacted immediately. The spiraling mass collapsed inward along axes that violated spatial continuity before reforming in a denser configuration, its forward lattice extending toward the null zone with enough compression to shear nearby structures into overlapping reflections. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s orbital platforms absorbed the resulting dimensional feedback as Stark's drones struggled to maintain lattice cohesion. Yet Möbius reported that the incursion's adaptive algorithms had begun treating the absence surrounding Saitama as a structural error to be corrected through environmental restructuring. Thor moved to intercept once more, driving Mjolnir into the advancing distortion with momentum rather than lightning. Yet the impact failed to produce displacement as the entity reconfigured around the contact point. Steve called out again for the unidentified man to move away from the convergence path before the next cycle completed, but Saitama appeared more interested in why the sky now reflected itself at multiple angles. High above the city, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s atmospheric grid entered critical overload. Across the globe, mirrored horizons extended into upper orbit. And inside the quarantine, Rift Entity 9 crossed the dominance threshold. The moment Rift Entity 9 crossed the dominance threshold, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s predictive models stopped projecting containment outcomes entirely and began calculating extinction-level restructuring probabilities across multiple dimensional baselines. Maria Hill watched the global telemetry grid desynchronize in cascading intervals as Stark's orbital lattice struggled to maintain coherence against environmental constants that no longer agreed with one another, because the incursion's latest convergence cycle had shifted from adaptive synchronization to enforced integration. Silent Möbius Command confirmed that psychic turbulence had reached saturation across the interlock network, yet every attempt to map the null zone inside the Manhattan pocket continued to fail in ways that suggested the absence surrounding the unidentified presence had become a fixed variable within the entity's internal structure. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark rerouted the last operational gravitic anchors toward the quarantine seam, while Fury authorized S.H.I.E.L.D.'s exo-atmospheric platforms to initiate resonance dampening at planetary scale, despite Möbius' warnings that further environmental resistance could accelerate the incursion's restructuring attempts. Katsumi Liqueur reported that Rift Entity 9 had begun interpreting failed synchronization not as obstruction, but as incomplete integration, prompting it to increase compression along every available dimensional vector simultaneously. Down below, Steve Rogers and Thor found themselves standing on what used to be Lexington Avenue, now suspended vertically against a skyline that reflected itself in recursive layers, as gravity inside the pocket reality shifted toward the convergence point with each passing second. Thor attempted to anchor their position by embedding Mjolnir into a fractured support column, yet the structure simply folded around the contact, as the entity's forward lattice advanced without measurable displacement. Saitama had started walking again, not because he understood the danger, but because the reflective plane beneath his feet appeared to lead somewhere that wasn't collapsing inward. Möbius suppression fields intensified automatically as Rift Entity 9 extended another spatial compression wave toward the null zone, yet the psionic interference passed through him without anchoring to any recognizable cognitive pathway. Rally Cheyenne confirmed that the absence surrounding Saitama had begun propagating through the entity's internal mapping algorithms, producing synchronization errors that spread outward along its structural lattice. Shield's deep space monitors registered identical distortions forming along Earth, magnetosphere, forcing Stark's corporate directive to divert power away from atmospheric stabilization in order to maintain quarantine integrity. The incursion responded by accelerating its convergence cycle. Its outer geometry collapsed inward along axes that Möbius analysts later compared to a Möbius strip attempting to invert itself, each layer restructuring to incorporate the null zone into a coherent dimensional gradient. Steve called out for Saitama to stop moving as the ground beneath them tilted toward the entity's core, yet the reply he received was a distracted acknowledgement followed by a question about whether the floating buildings were supposed to be like that. Thor moved to engage again, driving Mjolnir into the advancing distortion with enough force to register across S.H.I.E.L.D.'s orbital monitors. Yet the impact failed to produce lasting displacement as Rift Entity 9 reconfigured around the contact point. Möbius telemetry recorded another synchronization failure upon intersecting the null zone's boundary, but this time the misalignment propagated through the incursion's entire structure, causing its outer layers to collapse inward before reforming in a more aggressive configuration. High above, Stark's lattice flickered as planetary dampening engaged. Across the oceans, mirrored horizons extended into upper orbit. And inside the quarantine, Godfall synchronization began. When Godfall synchronization entered its second phase, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s remaining predictive models stopped referencing the Manhattan quarantine as a containment environment and began classifying it as an integration cradle. Because Rift Entity 9 was no longer attempting to align baseline reality with its internal geometry, but rewriting both simultaneously to eliminate the discrepancy centered on the null zone. Maria Hill watched the planetary telemetry grid fragment into overlapping spatial projections as Stark's orbital lattice attempted to maintain coherence across atmospheric sectors that now operated under conflicting gravitational constants, forcing the corporate containment directive into a full-spectrum reinforcement cycle that diverted power from every non-essential satellite in low Earth orbit. Silent Möbius Command reported simultaneous psychic feedback from operators stationed across multiple universes linked through the interlock network, each describing a perceptual lag that Katsumi Liqueur identified as reality restructuring itself faster than conscious thought could register environmental change. Rally Cheyenne attempted another remote scan of the null zone, not in the hope of detecting conventional cognition, but to determine whether the absence surrounding the unidentified presence had become an anchor point within the incursion's adaptive algorithms. Yet the feedback loop returned the same absolute void that had destabilized every prior telepathic attempt. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark rerouted the last operational gravitic anchors toward the quarantine seam, while Fury authorized S.H.I.E.L.D.'s exo-atmospheric platforms to initiate resonance dampening across the magnetosphere, despite Möbius warnings that further resistance might accelerate the incursion's restructuring attempts. The phase-lock beacons that remained active struggled to maintain dimensional cohesion, as Rift Entity 9 increased compression along indirect vectors, producing synchronization waves that propagated outward through Earth's atmospheric shell. Down within the sealed pocket, Steve Rogers and Thor found themselves repositioning along what used to be a vertical support column, now functioning as a horizontal surface, because gravity inside the quarantine had begun interpreting proximity to the convergence point as directional priority. Thor attempted to stabilize their position by driving Mjolnir into the reflective plane beneath them. Yet the surface simply curved inward around the hammer's contact point as Rift Entity 9 extended another forward lattice toward the null zone. Saitama paused when the air in front of him began folding into overlapping reflections of the skyline, then leaned slightly as the ground beneath his feet tilted toward the entity's core, unaware that Möbius telemetry had just recorded a synchronization attempt, propagating through the incursion's internal geometry at a rate previously associated with universe-bridging convergence events. Steve called out again for him to retreat before the next cycle completed, explaining that the environment was collapsing inward as Rift Entity 9 attempted to resolve the discrepancy created by his presence. The response he received was a casual acknowledgement followed by a question about whether this meant the exit was behind them. Rift Entity 9 reacted to his continued movement by collapsing its outer layers inward along axes that violated spatial continuity before reforming in a denser configuration, its forward lattice extending across the null zone with enough compression to shear nearby structures into recursive fragments. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s orbital platforms absorbed the resulting dimensional feedback as Stark's drones struggled to maintain lattice cohesion. Yet Möbius reported that the incursion's adaptive algorithms had begun treating the absence surrounding Saitama as a fixed constant within its internal structure. High above the city, the corporate directive initiated atmospheric lockdown. Across the globe, mirrored horizons extended beyond the ionosphere. And inside the quarantine, irreversible integration was already underway. By the time irreversible integration entered its terminal cycle, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s global command network had already begun archiving live telemetry rather than updating predictive models, because the environmental constants those models depended on no longer remained consistent long enough to generate usable projections. Maria Hill watched atmospheric coherence degrade across 3 orbital sectors as Stark's corporate containment lattice attempted to maintain structural alignment against a magnetosphere that now exhibited recursive dimensional layering, each fluctuation matching the same synchronization pressure Möbius had recorded whenever Rift Entity 9 attempted to incorporate the null zone centered on the unidentified presence. Silent Möbius Command reported that psychic turbulence had reached levels capable of destabilizing cross-universal interlock links, forcing Katsumi Liqueur to suspend all non-essential telepathic contact as operators began experiencing perceptual drift severe enough to desynchronize motor coordination. Rally Cheyenne confirmed that every attempt to map the absence surrounding Saitama now produced cascading feedback along Rift Entity 9's internal geometry, which Möbius analysts interpreted as the incursion attempting to reconcile an immovable variable by restructuring causal pathways rather than spatial gradients. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark initiated emergency shutdown of non-critical orbital platforms as resonance-dampening sequences began interfering with baseline reality outside the quarantine seam. Yet Fury refused to deactivate the remaining phase-lock beacons, despite Möbius warnings that further resistance could trigger a full-scale causal inversion event. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s exo-atmospheric defense grid struggled to maintain dimensional cohesion, as synchronization waves propagated outward through Earth's upper atmosphere, producing mirrored horizons that extended beyond the ionosphere into low orbit. Down within the sealed pocket, Steve Rogers and Thor found themselves standing on what Möbius later described as a collapsed convergence path, because the reflective plane beneath their feet now represented an incomplete integration attempt that Rift Entity 9 had abandoned in favor of rewriting the surrounding dimensional gradient. Thor drove Mjolnir into the surface to maintain position, yet the plane simply curved around the hammer's contact point as the entity's forward lattice advanced without measurable displacement. Saitama remained where he was, not out of strategic intent, but because the environment had become too unpredictable to navigate without risking a fall, and he appeared mildly annoyed that the ground no longer behaved like ground. Steve called out once more for him to move away from the convergence point before the next cycle completed, explaining that the entity was no longer attempting to synchronize through environmental restructuring, but through causal reassignment, which Möbius had warned could overwrite baseline reality entirely. Rift Entity 9 responded by collapsing its outer geometry inward along axes that violated temporal continuity as well as spatial orientation, each layer attempting to incorporate the null zone by redefining cause and effect rather than position. Möbius telemetry, registered synchronization, attempts propagating backward through recent environmental states, forcing Stark's lattice to compensate for distortions that had not yet occurred in linear time. High above the city, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s atmospheric grid flickered into standby as planetary dampening failed to maintain coherence against recursive causal feedback. Across the globe, mirrored coastlines began appearing hours before tidal shifts that would later justify their existence, prompting Fury to authorize archival lockdown of all real-time surveillance feeds. Inside the quarantine, the reflective plane beneath Saitama's feet fractured into overlapping temporal layers as Rift Entity 9 extended its forward lattice toward the null zone one final time, its adaptive algorithms attempting to resolve the discrepancy by collapsing every possible causal pathway into a single integrated state. The air around him thickened, the skyline above inverted, and the causal collapse cascade engaged. When the causal collapse cascade completed its engagement cycle, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s remaining surveillance feeds didn't cut out so much as overwrite themselves, because Rift Entity 9 had reached the point where synchronization attempts no longer required environmental restructuring to proceed. Maria Hill watched recorded telemetry from 47 seconds in the future replace real-time atmospheric readings across Stark's orbital lattice, each update aligning baseline reality more closely with the incursion's internal geometry, while phase-lock beacons struggled to maintain even localized dimensional coherence. Silent Möbius Command confirmed that psychic turbulence had exceeded interlock tolerance thresholds, forcing Katsumi Liqueur to sever cross-universal links before feedback destabilized parallel containment networks that had not yet encountered the incursion directly. Inside Avengers Tower, Tony Stark initiated emergency disengagement from the corporate containment directive, because the lattice had begun reinforcing environmental constants that no longer belonged to Earth's baseline dimensional state. Fury authorized immediate withdrawal of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s exo-atmospheric platforms despite the risk of leaving the Manhattan pocket unsupported, as Möbius telemetry indicated that further resistance might accelerate integration rather than impede it. Down within the sealed zone, Steve Rogers and Thor felt the shift before any instrument could register it, as gravity beneath their feet ceased interpreting proximity as directional priority, and instead aligned with the incursion's convergence point regardless of orientation. The reflective plane that had once been Lexington Avenue fractured into overlapping temporal layers that Möbius analysts later described as unresolved convergence paths, each attempting to integrate the null zone by redefining causal relationships rather than spatial alignment. Saitama stood at the center of those paths, mildly inconvenienced that the air had become difficult to breathe as it thickened into recursive pressure waves, and glanced upward when the inverted skyline began reflecting itself across multiple moments in time. Steve called out again for him to move before the next synchronization cycle completed, explaining that Rift Entity 9 was no longer attempting to incorporate his position, but to overwrite every causal pathway that allowed his presence to remain external to its structure. The response he received was a distracted acknowledgement followed by a comment that the sky looked strange. Rift Entity 9 reacted to his continued stability by collapsing its outer geometry inward along axes that Möbius confirmed now extended through temporal continuity, each layer attempting to resolve the discrepancy created by the null zone through forced integration of past and future environmental states. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s deep space monitors registered atmospheric distortions forming retroactively across multiple hemispheres, forcing Stark's remaining drones to disengage before the lattice began reinforcing events that had not yet occurred. Thor moved to intercept once more, driving Mjolnir into the advancing distortion with enough force to register across every operational monitor still linked to baseline reality. Yet the impact failed to produce measurable displacement as the entity reconfigured around the contact point. Möbius telemetry recorded another synchronization failure upon intersecting the null zone's boundary, but this time the misalignment propagated through the incursion's entire structure simultaneously, causing its forward lattice to fracture across causal seams. High above the city, mirrored horizons stabilized into permanent fixtures. Across the globe, atmospheric constants recalibrated without regard for prior states. And inside the quarantine, Rift Entity 9 attempted one final integration. The convergence arrived not as compression, but as absence, a restructuring wave that erased every unresolved pathway between the incursion's internal geometry and baseline reality in a single unified cycle. Möbius suppression fields collapsed instantly as psychic interference lost meaning within a causal framework that no longer supported external variance, while S.H.I.E.L.D.'s quarantine seemed dissolved into overlapping temporal layers that refused to maintain consistent sequence. Saitama took a step forward because the ground in front of him appeared less uneven. Möbius telemetry later confirmed that the synchronization attempt failed at the exact moment his foot crossed the convergence boundary, producing a causal misalignment. Rift Entity 9's adaptive algorithms could not reconcile through environmental or temporal restructuring. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s archived feeds showed the incursion's internal geometry collapsing inward along every available axis simultaneously, each layer attempting to incorporate an absence that refused to resolve into structure. The entity destabilized. Integration ceased. And baseline reality rewrote itself around the discrepancy. When the quarantine dissolved, Manhattan did not return to its previous state, because the skyline now reflected structural constants that had never existed before the incursion's arrival. Stark's orbital lattice recorded atmospheric gradients that aligned with Möbius telemetry from universes previously classified as parallel rather than adjacent, while S.H.I.E.L.D.'s global network confirmed that mirrored horizons had stabilized into permanent geospatial features. Steve Rogers stood on what used to be Lexington Avenue, now a surface that interpreted distance differently depending on orientation, and realized that the pocket reality had not been destroyed, but absorbed into Earth's dimensional baseline. Thor lifted Mjolnir from a support column that now curved upward toward a horizon occupying two positions at once, as Möbius Command reported that Rift Entity 9's internal geometry had ceased all adaptive activity. Saitama looked around, noticed the exit appeared closer now, and began walking toward it. Behind him, the world remained rewritten.